Welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom. Thanks for joining us today. Your hosts are myself, David Hamovich, and Alicia Cade, both within Google Cloud's Office of the CISO. You can find and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So Alicia, today our guest is Ryan McManus, a board director and operating partner who's at the epicenter of enterprise value creation in today's AI-driven economy. He's the founder of Tectonic.io, where he works directly with boards and CEOs on strategic and AI-enabled transformation. And he was recently named one of the top 100 most influential corporate directors in the United States by the National Association of Corporate Directors.
This is going to be exciting. Ryan's influence on modern governance is hard to overstate. He's currently the president of the NACD New York chapter and serves on the board of Nortech Systems, where he chairs the Science and Technology Committee. Previously, he was the COO of Accenture Strategy, and he brings to us a global and comprehensive ecosystem perspective on how boards can translate emerging tech into durable value backed with stronger governance. We are thrilled to be talking with him today.
Let's get right to the episode.
Let's go.
Today we're talking with Ryan McManus about the concept of total information mastery and how it's changing the game for enterprises. Boardroom conversations about AI have focused a lot on ROI and resiliency recently, but it seems there's a bigger shift happening where we're moving from simply holding data in companies to generating this concept of kinetic energy, where the data actively is powering a business now. So today we've invited Ryan to discuss what a good enterprise AI strategy looks like. And I assume given its total information mastery, we'll also touch on the concepts of cybersecurity as well. So Ryan, thank you for joining the Cyber Savvy Boardroom.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So I really like this concept that AI has brought this force to the global economy. Most boards traditionally have seen data kind of as an asset or a line item on a balance sheet. But if AI turns that into this kinetic energy, what's the board's role in ensuring that the company isn't just storing knowledge, but actually applying it now as a competitive force?
So one of the things that's interesting is that when you think about board agendas, data in and of itself was almost never a board topic outside of the technology industry, frankly, up until very recently with artificial intelligence. And to a degree, it's understandable because it's an intangible asset. It can't be valued on the balance sheet. It doesn't belong in financial reporting or those kinds of things. And so it just hasn't been on the specific radar of fiduciary responsibility and the rest, in particular of publicly traded companies, but even private. There are some that have treated it differently, treated it as an investable asset, actually created models through which they're looking at the value of the data and investing in it as if it was something that could be reported in more of the public market sorts of scenarios and frameworks, even though it can't, but they treat it as such, and therefore they look at it again as a value creating asset. For many organizations, it just was never part of the awareness. And what we've seen over the last really 12 months in particular is as artificial intelligence has grown in interest, and there's a real burgeoning understanding across sectors, across boards, across executive teams of how critically important this wave is already and is going to continue to be. And we can talk about some of the evolution that we're seeing coming through. Relatively rapidly, after there's an initial implementation of some of the off-the-shelf tools, the next stage of the conversation very naturally goes to, well, how do we differentiate? To your point about kinetic energy, how do we activate what our enterprise can do, and how do we make this more valuable in the particular enterprise context in which we are dealing? So AI has been this real unlock in terms of data strategy. And now, as often as not, when I'm having conversations, it's an AI conversation, but there's also an interest in understanding the foundational requirements of a high quality data strategy, which is going to be one of the sort of inputs as organizations look to maximize the value potential of artificial intelligence. And so this idea of total information mastery really breaks down the roadmap of artificial intelligence, largely in a business transformation sense. So the name Total Information Mastery comes from an article that I wrote with my colleague Igor Jablokov. We wrote it for the National Association of Corporate Directors several months ago. And the idea is that there are several levels of AI implementation that are forthcoming. One is the off-the-shelf tools, relatively easy to bring in, and really, even as easy as they are to bring in, some real spectacular productivity gains that we've seen from those. Secondly, you want an experimentation function so that you're staying at the edge of development, and things are, of course, moving very quickly. So you want to instrument that relatively explicitly. The third level will be, very simple indeed, because it will just be AI capabilities coming into the existing SaaS elements. And all of those first three categories, if you will have specific kinds of KPIs, specific kinds of value associated with it. But there's a fourth category which really gets into the enterprise data piece. And this starts to bring us into a very interesting conversation around how do we differentiate moving forward from the sector and from other players in the AI-powered economy. And what the article explores, this concept of total information explores, is that we need to be looking at all of these categories, but that fourth category, where we're really bringing in the data that only our organization has, and also an activation of the knowledge that only our organization has, that is almost by definition the entirety of what can be differentiated in terms of AI systems and capabilities moving forward, sort of by definition. And so when we get into board oversight, when we get into conversations around boards, around data, this gets very much into the fiduciary responsibilities that we have as directors, but also making sure that there's a regular conversation around not only immediately available AI tools and capabilities and some of this initial productivity opportunity, which is very front of mind right now, but also the longer term strategic oversight.
So Ryan, following on that story, you mentioned productivity. Some companies and some boards see it as the main goal of implementing AI. And they're focusing on 20%, 30% of cost savings, productivity increase, etc. Where does it leave them? Because there are two sides of the story. If a board only focuses on that and think this is the easy gain, let's do AI just for that sake, whilst the competitor builds an entirely new business model, they've already lost, right? And on the other hand, that drive to do things faster, more efficiently rather than differently, brings AI to the environment and creates new risks, right? And the risk functions, such as CISOs, especially from cybersecurity perspective, they're actually under pressure to cut the costs. Yes, and AI can bring efficiency in cyber too, but they have to deal with different types of risks and tackle them differently and make sure that there is the right governance supporting it. So it's a bit of a journey rather than perhaps a short-term win.
Yeah, absolutely. And the question that you're highlighting here is actually the most important strategic question over time that, again, boards and executives and CISOs to their role need to be asking. So basically, as exciting and different as AI is, and it's profoundly different in certain ways from previous generations of technology, the world has been through technology cycles and even platform shifts before. Mm-hmm. And there's a number of patterns which are very clear from these. We basically know exactly what wins and we know exactly what doesn't win. And Alicia, to your question, business models over time are the clear differentiator between the organizations that do well and the organizations that struggle. And so there's a couple of basic atomic unit questions that many leaders have struggled with over these previous sorts of cycles. The single best question, in my view, to articulate and explore this business model transformation is the following. How can we bring new value to our markets using new technology? And the emphasis is on those words, new. Alternatively, what we've seen, again, very much part of the pattern, is organizations will ask a much more limited but still important question. And that question is, how do we do what we do today better, faster, cheaper? And so we need to do both. And what we've seen over time is that many organizations have just not known to ask the first question. And that's where all of the disruption and the surprise comes from. But if we're asking both questions, then we have a really good opportunity to retain our leadership position and not get caught out, in particular in an environment like we have today where there's so much speed coming through. And so what that leads us to is a couple of different ways to think about productivity, right? We're still relatively early, despite all that's happening, we're still relatively early in this AI generation. And so there are immediate opportunities for productivity in terms of the work that we're already doing, be it in the CISO's team or be it in any sort of workflow. And as you said, it can be 20%, 30% here or there. There have been some research that's come out that even has gone up to high 80s, low 90s%, really year-on-year productivity jumps. And so we need to take advantage of that and be looking for that kind of differentiated performance. But when we start looking at the new things, the new value add, by definition, we haven't done those things yet. And so the requirements for CISOs actually expand. On the one hand, you want to take the productivity jumps that are immediately available for the more traditional core work, super important. On the other hand, you also have to keep pace with this exploration and experimentation, because as you know very well, there are entire portfolios of new cyber risks that we have to be looking at, but then also how do we protect the new value creating capabilities that we want to be bringing into the market. So there's a real richness here, and I think it behooves leaders to understand that you have to differentiate between immediately available and high priority tasks and focus, but also not lose sight of where things are going, because there's a lot more to do.
As we're talking about new risks, one widely discussed in public at a corporate level as well is that as there is more AI-generated content hitting the web, the public internet is actually becoming less reliable. From the risk oversight perspective, how does a board ensure that the company's total information awareness isn't built on sand, on foundations of digital noise and hallucinations? So basically, AI is for speed. However, the semantics are for quality, and they're still important.
It's critical. And so there's a few main considerations here. First of all, some people have referred to what you're describing as the dead internet, the idea that there's so much generative AI created data that it has become the majority of data. And so the very idea of having high quality data that is coming throughput in the models starts to get inherently risky. The easiest way to address this for enterprises is to ensure that enterprises are not solely relying on third-party public data, but that they're also curating an internal data set, a highly valuable, highly qualified third-party data set, a portfolio of subscriptions. So it's not to say that we shouldn't use public internet data, it's just that we want to make sure that we can validate and verify the source information. And so this is, again, part of this total information mastery and awareness idea. The question is, what are all of the sources that we need to optimize outcomes? And then furthermore, how can we have differentiated outcomes from the data and our own internal enterprise capability? So that's sort of point one. The second consideration to your question is about reliability of outputs. And so it does still happen regularly that we may not receive the full response that we're looking for. Perhaps the model ignores a certain source, perhaps it doesn't answer the prompt correctly, perhaps it just misses part of what we're looking for. I like to describe this as having at our fingertips what is effectively a brilliant yet potentially very fussy intern, in the sense that it may not understand immediately what you're asking. It may decide it doesn't want to do the work, and you may need to coach it and correct it and continue to work with the model or the particular output in order to get exactly what you need. The good news is all of this is getting better on a nearly daily basis, but it's still very important that people understand that they own the output of the work and that they need to validate the outputs in certain cases. There's probably one other topic that I hear a lot about from board directors, which is this idea of hallucination. And this can be the result of any number of things. And so again, for the moment, we all need to understand that we're individually responsible for not only how we use the tools, but how we use the outputs of the tools. The current generation of AI tools do an absolutely extraordinary job in terms of work acceleration, but we also need to understand that you'll get the best results when you bring in your expertise at the beginning of the process, knowing exactly what you want to get out of the tools, but then also verifying and quality assuring the outputs at the end. It's that middle part that the tools are really particularly very good at. And so the good news around all of this is that it's getting much easier. There's trillions and trillions of dollars of market value at stake on exactly this particular capability. You can imagine if we don't have higher quality models, then the opportunity value is going to decline precipitously. And so there's lots of activity, there's lots of new capability that comes out on a regular basis, even on a weekly, if not faster basis, that is purely designed to improve the quality of the outputs. It's getting easier and more reliable.
There's one other kind of risk I wanted to talk about as well, which is the risk around the concept of model collapse, where an AI system essentially begins to degrade because it's training itself on its own output now. And so for a director who's not obviously a data scientist, what are the actual business symptoms or those smoke signals that boards should be looking at to know if their AI infrastructure is starting to degrade? And I'm just thinking about things. Is it trends around the diversity of the output of the AI? Is it customers escalating to ask about human interactions instead of working with AI agents potentially? What are kind of some of your thoughts around the risks associated with model collapse?
So model collapse is one of these sort of unexpected things if you're not looking for it, because we sort of assume that we're going to be bringing in the tools, we'll have the productivity jumps that we talked about earlier, and then suddenly everything is blue sky and we continue to have that kind of accelerated performance. It's not necessarily the case unless you actually explicitly design your architecture for protecting against things like model collapse. And obviously there's all kinds of risks in terms of the technology, model collapse being one that is foremost in mind for a lot of people because it just happens that that's being experienced on a regularly more current basis. To your question, in terms of what do we look for, there's a handful of things. And it's important to get the context of this right. We don't want to compare where we are pre-AI to where we are on sort of day one in terms of these model collapses. What we want to do is understand once we get to, let's call it phase one peak AI in terms of throughput, productivity, and quality, do we see degradation in the signal from that point? So there should be a ramping up as we're implementing the tools, training the models, and then we should hit a higher productivity and quality level. And based on where we land there, if we see degradation in things like longer decision cycles, rising manual overrides of AI inputs, increased exception handling, lagging or missing data in outputs, or to your point, David, employee or customer complaints about inconsistency or errors. In other words, if we see the performance of the system, however we define it, start to fall, could be lower workflow throughput, it could be lower sales, it could be any number of things that we have in particularly identified KPIs. In other words, people are using the tools less and they're trusting them less than at that peak level. We know that we have something to look at. We know we have something to fix.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So I wanted to pivot and talk a little bit about the new talent contract as well. I wanted to ask specifically about a residuals model for employees, so rewarding people for the intellectual property that they're contributing to the AI. And that's a big cultural shift and a compensation shift as well. So paying for time, but equity in the overall kind of engine of AI that we're working on. So how should a board's compensation committee think about this new value sharing model between the enterprise and its human experts?
Great. So boards need to realize that AI will have different consequences over the next several years as it continues to mature and as it continues to develop. Currently, we're seeing the most impact on productivity, but ultimately the long tail of AI will be on decision quality and new value creation. So productivity over time becomes a secondary effect, still very important, but for now it deserves a lot of board attention because it can have a meaningful set of relatively immediate impacts. And to your point, it prepares the organization and culture for the later stage opportunities as they effectively manifest. So if we look at talent strategy, we also want to incentivize these next level contributions, and these can fall into a couple of different areas. One, which is getting a lot of pickup in 2026 already, is around workflows. This can be anything from creating reusable Gemini gems to custom AI tools through to agents. This idea of reusable best practice processes that drive more enterprise or functional specific productivity in the company. The second level is around expert knowledge contributions, where AI can actually scale the impact of a particular individual's expertise either across the enterprise or across customers. And so the fundamental question with all of this is, what new outcomes do we want to achieve, and how do we incentivize our people to deliver these? It becomes even more important when you understand that everyone is now capable of developing AI solutions, right? We've heard of the YouTubeization of development. We've heard of billions of software designers and engineers. And there's also, again, research that shows that when workflows are redesigned for AI, the ROI per dollar actually doubles. This is all very new kinds of data and very new kinds of analysis. Most organizations have not reconsidered their incentive structures yet. So if you have people who are incented just to do their individual job, but they have the ability to create larger scale impacts, it's worth considering new ways to turbocharge that. And there's also, of course, a range of comp structures which can be considered, ranging from spot bonuses to enhanced share portfolios, or this idea of longer tail value sharing. So if somebody's contribution outstrips their individual targets, why wouldn't we want to look at rewarding them differently? AI also, of course, provides us with new ways to measure and quantify those contributions so we can actually track the impact over time. Relatively new consideration there. And the risk of not doing this is that the best people leave for places which will give them those differentiated rewards. And of course, we all know that the most AI savvy talent is in very high demand. And so part and parcel of what's happening with AI today is this ability for individuals, either independently with smaller organizations or with larger organizations, to make an outsized contribution compared to where we were with traditional sort of incumbent business models. And if we're not paying attention to how to instrument that on all levels, then we really risk missing a couple of tricks.
It's really kind of like stock options for intellectual property. And it's interesting that a board would also, I think, need to kind of oversee the IP attribution piece of it and ensure you have the infrastructure in place to be able to say that a specific employee contributed to this component of an AI model.
It's a very provocative thing to say. How closely the world actually gets to adopting this sort of thing will be determined, as we go. I think there's a tendency to say we just don't do that. It's too hard. It's too complicated. Your point about IP attribution and the rest is very important. Of course, not every value contribution is IP particular. It could be expertise in particular. But it's the kind of question that I think prompts a recognition of, to Alicia's earlier question, the business model conversation. How are we bringing new value to the market? How might we be inadvertently risking losing pace on creating that value if we, for example, lose our best expertise because they can get monetized in different ways in other places? And so this competitive market for talent is not only about the particular job, it's also about how do we, really create differentiated targets and incentives for top performers.
But talking about talent life cycle, humans do retire at some point or actually jump to other companies. And we need to think about the talent pipeline. And if we use AI to automate all the work that normally junior analysts would be doing, or like you mentioned, interns and middle managers used to do, are we accidentally, perhaps it's not accidental, but it is destroying the traditional concept of junior workforce apprenticeship and then growth of expertise throughout one's professional life. So what does it mean for the future leadership pipeline? And from succession planning standpoint, thinking more longer term, what should the board be asking their chief HR officer, human resource officer, to ensure that we're still building sustainable talent resource within the company? I can imagine it's going to look very different to what we are used to from traditional perspective. But how do we get the new talent coming in, being able to use the tools and being able to thrive on the expertise that's in the tools without having perhaps that growth path that we have had?
It's one of these questions that is getting more and more credence and more appreciation of its importance. We've been talking about it for years, and so it's actually really important and a good signal to see boards asking exactly these kinds of questions, because, again, boards have a longer-term fiduciary responsibility and oversight, so we need to be providing for that longer-term roadmap for the organizations, not only for what could be an immediate productivity or EBITDA bump by not hiring a certain class of people, or not hiring a certain cohort of people, I should say. So what do we know? We know that for people who use the tools without going through a more traditional in-depth education, there is a cognitive gap. And so that is of concern. We also know that there's a decline of traditional training or apprenticeship programs. And this is really around having a confidence in the progression and the managerial capabilities of people as they progress in their careers. In other words, how do we know that people know what they're doing as opposed to just be using the tools and not being able to qualify the outputs? The good news is that AI can actually make people value contributing much faster through personalization, through more rapid onboarding, through correcting earlier mistakes. And so there's lots of examples of this where actually when you bring new people in, through the right kinds of tool enablement, they are able to contribute to the organization materially faster. But this particular point is important to keep in mind, because we do anticipate for the foreseeable future, of course, that we'll still need people to be owning the outputs of the models. We'll still need people to be guaranteeing the quality of the outputs of the models. And so if we don't have confidence that people know what they're doing, how would we have confidence that we can use the tools, right, at any sort of important scale? This is, in my mind, a design question. So step number one is to realize the risk here. Step number two is to not decide that you can just, in a large scale, not hire junior people. Step number three is to understand that we do need managerial and or technical or functional expertise at the end of all of the use cases of these tools. And then the design question is, how do we provide for two things? One is expertise development, when that apprenticeship sort of structure may be degrading. Number two is, how do we actually even test the quality of the expertise of people before they get into a position where, given the scale capabilities of AI, they might make a rather broad kind of mistake because we haven't actually qualified them. Historically, we know that people are qualified because we've all come up through the same kinds of dynamics and training and culture and those sorts of things, experience. As that changes, we have to replace it, but we have to replace it carefully to make sure that we're not, on the one hand, we're not losing something that we need longer term, but also, frankly, that we take advantage of what the new capabilities of the new generations are in terms of a greater affinity for the tools.
I think it also poses a lot of questions and horizons for education and actually approach to education. Of course, everybody graduates through school system, etc., and hits now this new business reality. We need to make sure that that generation is prepared for that rather than being limited to tinkering with various AI tools at home.
It's always been the case that there's been some kind of additional education when junior people come into an organization, right? Different industries have very different intensity of internship programs or junior analyst programs or whatever, junior associate programs, whatever the case may be. The current research is a little bit troubling with the idea that there may be even more requirement to fill in some gaps. Because just like when someone comes into an organization, if all they're doing is using the tools, they may not master the expertise of the particular sector or company. It's exactly the same question in the university or college setting. If all they're doing is using the tools, then how do we know that they're actually generating the kind of educational capability, intellectual capability that we have historically expected because somebody has completed an education or a certain kind of degree program? So there's just a lot more room for, again, validation, planning to identify and maybe address some gaps that we haven't traditionally had to do. That's all fine. The good news is the tools let us do this much more easily than we would have been able to do before, but also personalize the way that we fill in those gaps with people to really help them get on the ground running.
We have discussed a lot here from kind of business transformational, culture transformational, social transformational perspective. But the reality is we still see a lot of what I would term an AI theater, where companies learn a lot of little pilots that don't really scale, tinkering with the tools, just to dip the toe and kind of explore. If you are a director sitting on a science, technology, or innovation committee, what are the 2 or 3 metrics that would actually prove that the organization is moving towards the mastery rather than that theater and spending the R&D budget?
So I'll combine a couple of things that we've talked about. Obviously, the responsibility of directors is at a fiduciary level, risk management level, and longer-term strategic oversight context. And so that's the job description that should drive the kinds of metrics that directors are looking at. And so there's nothing wrong with some experiments. Of course, we're getting our feet wet. We're learning how to use the tools. If that's all that we do, then that's a problem. But if we come back to the total information mastery idea, and we mirror that with the fiduciary and the longer term strategic context, then that really gives us the kinds of questions that we want to be looking at. So there's more and more explicit governance structure happening in both public and private markets, by which I mean dedicated either board committees or dedicated regular time on the full board agenda to talk about technology-enabled value creation and risk. For years, this was a sort of back office kind of consideration. Maybe it was talked about once a year, maybe. I've seen an incredible uptick in terms of boards actually pulling for more information and expertise around this because they realize how critically important it is to get exactly your question, Elisa, right. So in no particular order, here are the three things. If we only have three, here are the three things that I think boards should be asking for. Number one, 2026 is going to be a lot more about ROI per dollar invested, not just the experimental portfolio. And we have some initial research that's coming out that's showing somewhere between 2 and 10x, 10x being an outlier in terms of value creation, again, per dollar invested in AI. So we're looking for larger productivity deltas. We're looking for EBITDA impact. This will be what I think boards are really getting more scrutinizing about in 2026. It's no longer just about learning. It's about what are we getting from this. The second point, critically, to balance the opportunity set is cybersecurity metrics. This can be compliance with NIST frameworks or whatever works for your particular sector. It's a both offense and defense conversation. I think largely speaking, boards understand how critical cybersecurity is in this area. But then the third point is really the one where I think most organizations have fallen off historically. And this is that future-focused conversation that again brings us back to, are we keeping track with business model evolution in the sector? This is around things like how much of our workflow has been redesigned. That's a simple percentage calculation. By the way, that ties directly to ROI because we know redesigned workflows plus AI doubles the ROI on a per dollar basis. Number two, progress towards total information mastery. So we're looking at all of those categories of enablement. And then number three, experimenting with what's next, but doing that in a way that is focused on new value creation. And then probably longer term, again, depending on the sector that the company is in, there's a lot more coming. In my view, we're at year 2 of a 10-year journey here, and we've barely seen the outputs of the new trillion sort of parameter AI chips. We've barely seen outputs of the agentic capabilities, which are getting a lot of conversation these days. We've barely seen the outputs of world AI and robotics and the physical world being instrumented. So there's more to come than what we've already seen, and making sure that boards are asking questions about that and staying current actually represents both an opportunity, but sort of a governance challenge, because boards traditionally have not been in a position where they've had to keep up with the pace that AI is driving. And so that changing of the board structures to explicitly provide for that actually is, I think, a required mechanism to tracking these metrics.
Okay, Ryan, one final question, and it's your drop the mic moment. What's one action a board member should take away based on today's discussion?
So what we see is that there's very naturally a difference in levels of understanding of AI across the boardroom. None of them necessarily being wrong, but many of them being, let's call it, slightly tactical. And so the most impactful thing I think immediately boards can do is to have a full board conversation, perhaps a training, about what is really happening here. What are the economic patterns? Again, we know what wins, we know what loses. What are the emergent risks? What's the regulatory environment that's important for our business? What are the talent and culture implications? Why is it so important to be looking at frameworks like total information mastery, but also the business model evolution? What are the high priority cybersecurity topics that we have to be tracking? How do we know that we can have confidence that the groups we're working with are actually, staying current with all of these things? That provides everybody on the board with a common and consistent and cohesive foundational understanding at a strategic level of what's really happening in markets. By the way, trillions of dollars being invested, massive amounts of EBITDA sort of at stake, trillions and trillions of dollars of new value creation forecasted, not by the AI industry, but by investment banking and markets. And so how are we looking to get our piece of that growth as opposed to missing the boat? All of this forward-looking strategic kind of context can come through relatively quickly if you do this in the right way. And then what you want as a result of that is a 3-year roadmap that we can review and evolve on a quarterly basis, right? That brings in all of the sort of elements that we've talked about in our conversation today: opportunity, productivity, investment, fiduciary, cybersecurity risk, et cetera, talent. And so we want that complete roadmap that we revisit at least on a quarterly basis, not least because things are moving so incredibly quickly that if we'd only do this on an annual strategic planning cycle, we're going to be so far behind the curve, it won't even be funny.
Ryan, thank you for joining us in the Cyber Savvy Boardroom.
Thanks very much. My pleasure.
Thank you so much.